Let's get back now to that breaking news. We now have connection with our man in DC, a Tube News presenter in Washington, Ben Leo. Ben, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us at short notice. A significant breaking news, or perhaps not a surprising one for the president. What do you think will happen next?
Martin, good morning from DC. I think it is a surprising decision for President Trump and his team. It was only a few days ago that the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, was saying that he expected the Supreme Court to align with the administration. So I think this comes as a shock. Instantly off the back of this, we've seen the markets this morning here, this side of the pond, the S&P, the Dow, they've enjoyed this news, markets ticking up. So good news for stock traders and investors. However, bad news indeed, Martin, for President Trump and the administration, because as it stands now, they are due, as a result of this decision, to refund countries all over the world something like $175 billion in tariff money that they'd swiped over the past 12 months. Scott Bessent saying already that the Treasury can afford to cover that outlay. However, as an example, the Department of Justice budget last year in 2025 was $47 billion. The Department of Transport budget was something similar. So refunding nations all over the world, including the likes of China, where President Trump is heading for a visit in April, $175 billion, it's going to take a massive hit. Not least, it's going to be a massive hit to President Trump's authority and to the momentum of his administration, because he's in Georgia today, Martin, trying to rally the troops. And instead of talking about international wars and interventionism, he's trying to get this message across to the American electorate that the cost of living is going down, things are going well domestically and economically, instead of banging on about the likes of Venezuela and Iran. But this decision came as Trump was in Georgia today, so bad timing.
Ben, for people here in Britain who perhaps aren't as au fait with the technicalities of the American legal system, the Supreme Court, how political is this decision? We heard so many decisions before President Trump was elected where the courts were weaponized against him. There were always opinions of a democratic takedown. Anything that Donald Trump put forward, they tried to derail. Does this fall into that category?
So the Supreme Court ruled against the tariffs 6-3. And the reason they ruled against it, just very briefly, is because they say he invoked emergency powers to do so instead of going to Congress basically and using tariff legislation. Yeah. So they said he wasn't allowed to do that. So the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in majority. There's 3 liberal justices and there's 3 conservative justices. However, 2 conservatives, including the likes of Brett Kavanaugh, who viewers and listeners may be familiar with, because when he was first appointed to the Supreme Court, there was this massive story about whether he was kind of misbehaving in his youth. There was a big Democratic attempt to kind of smear him. He abstained from the vote. So it went 6-3 against the Trump administration. So it is mostly packed with conservatives. However, on this occasion, they have lost the vote, Martin.
And as you say, the markets will like this because we've seen so much turmoil right the way from Tariff Day. Tariff is the most beautiful word in the English dictionary. Of course, Donald Trump was famously quoted as saying that day that who can forget that leaderboard of tariffs he put. It was like a game show where everyone was a loser, Ben Leo, and they got their tariffs slapped on them right across the world. The United Kingdom came out relatively okay as a mere 15%, I believe, on that leaderboard. It's a huge job to try and unpick this, Ben Leo, and work out which money is owed back. It's incredibly time-consuming and complicated.
Well, there are some tariffs which are unaffected. So the specific law which the Supreme Court said wasn't allowed to be invoked was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA. That gives the president the power to regulate trade in response to an emergency. They said, no, you weren't allowed to do that. So he first invoked it in February 2025 to tax goods from China. For example, as I said, China, where he's going in April, they on average are tariffed about 45% in terms of their relationship with the United States. Canada as well, you mentioned the United Kingdom as well. The unaffected tariffs include industry specified steel, aluminium, lumber, automotive tariffs as well, because they were invoked under something called the Trade Expansion Act of, I think it was 1962 off the top of my head. So they're fine. But the bulk of the President Trump's tariffs come under these emergency powers, which he invoked in February and again the second time in April last year, as far as I remember. They said, no, you're not allowed to do that. It's for emergencies only. So as it stands, Martin, customer service department of the White House is going to be busy because they, for now, will be organising refunds for nations all over the world.
Well, Ben Leo, thank you for joining us at short notice there from DC. Our man in Washington, Ben Leo, superb as ever. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the show, Ben Leo. Speak to you later on in the show.
Hello, I'm Bev Turner. Now, it can feel like the money in our bank accounts at the moment does not keep up with the cost of living. And maybe there's a solution. I'm here today with the CEO of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. Cameron, what is TallyMoney?
Well, Bev, with TallyMoney, you get a current account and a debit card, but instead of pounds, you use milligrams of gold as your everyday money.
So why gold?
Gold traditionally is a great store of value. It has, on average, gone up at over 11% per annum for the last 25 years against the pound. It's tripled in value in the last decade. And in the last 2 years alone, it's increased by 50% against the pound. Banks' savings products just can't compete with that level of growth.
But this isn't just about gold. This is about a currency that you guys have created at TallyMoney. Explain it to me as though I'm an idiot.
So, look, people need to be able to hold their earnings and build their savings in a money that retains its value and remains in their legal control and remains theirs to access, away from government control.
Great. You had me at not exposed to government control.
You should feel safe and happy with your money. You should have peace of mind. The more money you see in your bank balance, and that's the type of thing we're trying to deliver, and give people choice in the type of money they get to use every day.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you.
And now let's get back to the chairman of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson. Greg, welcome back. Yay, we can see you, Greg. You're not frozen solid. I think, wow, you're so good at standing still, like you're in Madame Tussauds, but no, we had a frozen line. Greg Swenson, on a serious point, how damaging do you think this could be perceived as being for President Trump?
I don't think it will be that damaging, Martin. I think Ben, nailed it on most of his points. I think it's a speed bump because there's other issues around this. There's other levers that the president can use to impose these tariffs. So I'm not sure you're going to see massive refunds right away. They of course can, invoke other rules and regs in trading world, in treasury world, and keep these tariffs on. At least they'll try. But, I've heard some commentary already from John Yoo, for example, who's a really well-respected legal expert and an expert on the Supreme Court and the Constitution. He's actually very optimistic as well, that you can use other levers. I saw Kevin Hassert briefly on television from the Economic Council, or the chief economist, essentially, for the White House. And he's saying the same thing, that this was the preferred lever originally, but it's not the only lever.
And Greg, I want to ask the same question to you that I did to Ben Leo, if I could. We saw so much evidence this side of the pond of politically motivated lawsuits against Trump when he was the president-elect. Is there any of that shenanigans going on here? Is it specifically designed to damage Trump, or is it actually a clean takedown?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, Martin, because anything that the president does will be rejected by the progressive left, and 3 of those judges were automatic votes against. I mean, there was no mystery at all that the 3 liberal justices, 2 of the 3 are basically activists, progressive activist judges. So I'm not surprised there, but I think it proves that the conservative judges, I don't even like to say they're conservative. They're just originalists. They're constitutionalists, and often they vote with the left because they vote, not just with their conscience, but they vote according to the Constitution. And so in this case, I think they have a good point that the lever that was used is the Emergency Act. And, they're arguing that, who defines what an emergency is? It wasn't really an urgent emergency. You can make the case that it was, that, these massive trade deficits and dependency on China and the gutting of the heartland here in America. But you can understand the argument the other way. So I think the president has to go to Congress and get this done, or use some different mechanisms that he has in his toolkit.
So that's the equivalent in Britain of just taking this to a higher court, of delaying, of laying down more barriers, and perhaps kicking it into the long grass. So effectively, it's business as usual.
Yeah. I think that's what will happen, because, the funny thing is, now that it's almost 12 months later, these tariffs have worked. They've done exactly what the president said that they would do. They've brought massive amounts of revenue into the Treasury to help balance the budget. They've repositioned or reprioritized some industry. They've created a lot of incentive for foreign direct investment. These tariffs have been fantastic, and with no effect on inflation, as all the scaremongers on the left were saying it would, without evidence.
And Greg Swenson, of course, one of the huge parts of Donald Trump's economic model was to bring business back to American soil. Yes. We've seen with pharmaceuticals, with electronics, build back in America, get on American soil. And we'd like to see that, I think, on this side of the pond too, instead of offshoring everything to China, offshoring everything where it's cheaper overseas. So it's not just about the importation tariffs, it's about encouraging, or actually leveraging, business to go back to the States.
Absolutely. You're seeing massive foreign direct investment. Your factories are being built. It takes a while just with the planning and the permitting, but you're seeing a lot of capital come into the country, and you'll see a lot of reshoring and friendshoring going on. So I'm real confident that most of these tariffs ultimately will stick. And in the context of tax reform, deregulation, and especially the liberation of the energy sector, we have a real economic boom going on here in the United States. I hope the UK can take a few pages out of that playbook, although I'm not confident it'll happen in the next 3 years.
Greg Swenson, as I have here, can I please ask you for your take on the Chagos farce?
Yes.
What's happening here? We were speaking about it on the show a short while ago. You may have heard. Basically, the denial of access to RF bases by Sir Keir Starmer to Donald Trump seems to me to be a violation of the special relationship. But could the price of revenge be Donald Trump now torpedoes the Chagos deal?
Oh, absolutely, he should. And there's been a lot of great work done here in the UK, in the United Kingdom. I think the Great British PAC has done a great job, Ben Habib specifically, and his team. There's a lot of effort that's going on right now in the UK, in London. So I'm really happy about that. And of course, a lot of us are pushing the White House to stop this thing. It's absolutely insane. And I think that this retribution from the government and denying access to the airbase, when we're assembling a massive fleet in and around the Gulf. I mean, it's just so uncool is the best word I could come up with. And it shows you that, back to the Greenland argument, everybody was saying, oh, you don't need Greenland because Denmark's always going to say yes to your requests to use the base up there or to add bases. And Keir Starmer has just proven the president's case for Greenland, as well as the fact that this Chagos thing is a complete disaster.
Isn't it funny how international law seems to apply in certain spaces but not in others?
Yes.
I mean, time and time again, Sir Keir Starmer saying it's uniquely and solely the responsibility and choice of Greenlanders to decide what happens in Greenland, but nobody in the Chagos Islands ever got a say.
Right, and it's really sad, but good for them for moving back to the island and establishing British occupancy. It's really well done from so many different inputs from the UK and from the Chagos Islands, and so good for him. But my guess is that he'll roll back on this. The president, I imagine, will be really annoyed, and I think that ultimately we will be using the base in Diego Garcia if we do anything in Iran.
Greg, as I have here, I want to get your take on Iran. I mean, we are seeing this absolutely gigantic amassing of military arsenal, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades, the world's biggest aircraft carriers, the entire American war machine just waiting to pull the trigger. How likely do you think it is that there's going to be a move against Iran, and how soon?
Well, if it happens, it's going to be in the next 10 or so days. The president has stated that. I think he casually said 10 or 15. If I know President Trump, it'll be day 9. He'll have a little bit of an element of surprise. But yeah, it is a massive buildup. It's the largest since the Iraq War, the invasion of Iraq. It's close to home for me. My nephew, Zach Swenson, is a Navy fighter pilot on the Abraham Lincoln. So that was the first carrier to arrive in the Gulf. He's an F-18 Super Hornet pilot. So it's close to home. Obviously, the president and most of us, all of us, don't want an armed invasion or use of military force. We would prefer diplomacy. But as they learned last summer, if they don't agree to a deal that's acceptable to the U.S., he will definitely use force, and it will be quick and it will be ugly.
Okay, Greg Swenson, it's a pleasure to have your company. It was worth waiting for. And the USS Abraham Lincoln is sincerely one of the most impressive pieces of military hardware in the history of humanity. And please pass on our regards from GB News to your family member there fighting for your country.
Will do.
Greg Swenson, always a pleasure to have your company. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Martin.
Thanks, mate. Now, continuing on this story, the US Supreme Court rejecting Donald Trump's trade tariffs. Let's bring in my next guest now. I'm delighted to be joined by the US political commentator, Hillary Fordwich. Hillary, it's a pleasure to have your company. Tell us, how damaging do you think this is for the Trump regime?
Well, Martin, pleasure to be back with you, except for a ghastly subject here, because this is terrible. I will say that actually I'll quote President Trump, who said that this is a life or death issue for the U.S. This is very serious. The only hope really is that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has been quoted as saying, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, when he was asked about this ruling before it came down. But yes, it was a 6-3 decision by the Supreme Court justices. And it was this Emergency Powers Act. Actually, I believe it was instituted in 1977, signed by then President Carter, who, of course, was a Democratic president. But it was about emergency power acts. And what President Trump has basically always claimed, and the administration has claimed, is that this is an emergency issue for the U.S., that the U.S. has been taken advantage of by these trade agreements, and that it was a national security issue. That is what is at stake, national security, because, Martin, of the fentanyl deaths. More Americans have died of fentanyl and fentanyl coming across the border than in both of the world wars. But all of the wars since the Second World War. So it's been a really serious life and death issue in that regard, with regard to drugs, but also financially.
Hillary, do you think that Donald Trump will do what he's often done so many times in the past and pivot this as the institution, the legal framework of America, not only against the president, but against the people? If the economy is going to be robbed of so much money coming from importation tariffs, that surely will hit the cost of living. Might Trump pivot and make this the people versus the powers that be?
Well, that's a very good question and a very good sort of supposition there, because actually it is against the people. And one of the things I've always thought is, okay, so this ruling, if this money has to be paid back to those companies, and by the way, it was a sort of a conglomeration of small businesses. I believe there was a toy manufacturer and there's a wine business, a lot of small businesses united for this suit that went to the Supreme Court. Do you think those companies are going to give the money that they receive back to the consumer or back to the public? No, they're going to pocket it themselves. That isn't going to go to the American public. And everything that President Trump is doing with this money was to benefit the US population, the US taxpayer. So I think you're absolutely right on that supposition, yes.
Can I ask you, Hillary, the question I asked Greg and the question I asked Ben Leo? Over this side of the pond, we're so used now to the legal system almost being weaponised against Donald Trump. In actual fact, we saw a huge amount of that during the Brexit years. This side of the pond, it was felt that the powers that be over here were working against the people, working against the will of the government. Is that still prevalent, do you think, in this decision? Is this an anti-Trump decision?
Well, you're absolutely right there. One of the things, Martin, I've always said, particularly with each of the elections, actually, was I've always said it wasn't that President Trump beat, then President Biden and the Democratic Party. He beat also all of social media, all of the legacy media, sort of the deep state. And I will tell you, there are even business apps where if you post anything where you've been on one of the, I detest the term right wing because it makes it sound extreme, but just being for law and order and people paying their taxes and legal immigration like I am, you're now considered right wing.